The man who had become one of America's most iconic actors looked like he had forgotten how to be himself. Robert De Niro sat across from Jimmy Fallon in Studio 6B, his legendary intensity somehow hollow, as if the method acting that had made him famous had slowly consumed the person underneath. The performer who had built a career on disappearing into characters now seemed to be discovering that he might have disappeared entirely. They'd been playing Acting Truth, a Tonight Show game where actors discuss the relationship between their craft and their identity. For Robert, it had become something that looked increasingly like a search for someone who might no longer exist. "Robert, here's a question every method actor thinks about," Jimmy had said with obvious reverence. "You've created some of cinema's most unforgettable characters. When you finish a role, how do you find your way back to being Robert De Niro?" The question should have been an opportunity for Robert to celebrate his legendary craft. Instead, Jimmy watched as one of acting's most respected performers began to quietly unravel. "Jimmy?" Robert said, his voice missing its usual commanding presence. "That's exactly the problem. I don't think I know how to find my way back anymore. I'm not sure there's a Robert De Niro left to find." The studio fell silent, sensing that whatever was coming would reveal something profound about the cost of total artistic immersion. "For 50 years, I've been living other people's lives," Robert continued, his voice carrying a weight that surprised everyone. "Travis Bickle, Jake LaMotta, Vito Corleone. I didn't just play them, I became them. And somewhere in all that becoming, I stopped being me." Jimmy felt his entertainment instincts give way to concern. "What do you mean you stopped being you?" Robert looked down at his hands that had gestured through countless iconic scenes. And when he looked back up, his eyes carried something devastating: confusion about his own identity. "I mean, I can access any character's emotions instantly, but I can't remember what my own emotions feel like," he said, his voice becoming uncertain. "I know exactly how Travis Bickle feels when he's angry, how Jake LaMotta processes jealousy, how Vito Corleone handles betrayal. But if you ask me how Robert De Niro feels about anything, I'd have to create a character to answer that question." Jimmy made a decision to sit directly next to Robert, understanding this conversation required presence, not performance. "When did you first notice this happening?" Jimmy asked gently. "It was gradual," Robert admitted. "When I started method acting, it was liberating. I could explore parts of human experience that felt forbidden to me personally. But then it became my only way of accessing emotion. I stopped having feelings as Robert and started borrowing them from characters." He shifted in his chair, the weight of decades pressing down on him. "I remember my first big role. I spent months preparing, living as that character. My friends didn't recognize me anymore. My family said I'd become a stranger in my own home. But the performance was brilliant, so I thought it was worth it. I thought that was just the price of great art." The studio remained silent as Robert continued, his voice growing more reflective. "Each role after that, I went deeper. More preparation, more immersion, less of myself. The critics loved it. The audiences were mesmerized. Awards followed. But with each character I perfected, another piece of Robert disappeared. I convinced myself that was evolution, not erosion." He paused, clearly accessing memories that were both professional triumph and personal loss. "I realized a few years ago that I hadn't had an authentic emotional response to anything in decades. My daughter graduated college and I felt nothing. Not because I didn't love her, but because Robert De Niro doesn't know how to feel pride without it being scripted." The audience was completely silent, beginning to understand how artistic mastery could become emotional imprisonment. "I'll give you an example," Robert continued, tears beginning to form. "When my father died, I couldn't grieve as myself. I found myself accessing the grief of characters I'd played, performing mourning instead of experiencing it. I was method acting my own father's funeral. Jimmy felt his heart break for the man sitting next to him. That must be terrifying. It is, Robert said simply, because when you've been performing emotions for so long, you forget what authentic feeling is supposed to feel like. I know what cinematic emotion looks like, but I have no idea what real emotion feels like anymore. Jimmy was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of what Robert was sharing. What do you think Robert De Niro was like before he became a method actor? Robert looked genuinely surprised by the question, as if no one had asked him to remember his pre-acting self in decades. He was curious, Robert said slowly, searching through buried memories. He wanted to understand people, to connect with them. He was sensitive, maybe too sensitive for the world. He felt things deeply, which is probably why hiding in characters felt so safe. What happened to that sensitivity? Jimmy asked. I trained it out of myself, Robert admitted, because Robert De Niro's sensitivity wasn't useful for my career. But Travis Bickle's alienation was. Jake LaMotta's rage was. I kept the emotions that served my craft and buried the ones that made me vulnerable. Jimmy reached over and placed a supportive hand on Robert's shoulder. What if that sensitive person is still there? What if he's just been waiting for permission to exist again? For the first time in the conversation, Robert's eyes showed something other than emptiness. I never thought of it that way. What would it feel like to have an emotion that wasn't borrowed from a character? Jimmy asked. I don't know, Robert said, and for the first time, his uncertainty felt hopeful rather than frightening. Scary, probably, but maybe real. Jimmy turned to address the audience. How many people in here love Robert De Niro not just for his characters, but for the person brave enough to create those characters? Hands shot up throughout the studio, and the applause was immediate and genuine. Jimmy turned back to Robert. You see that? They don't just love your performances, they love the artist behind them. Robert looked out at the response, and something in his expression began to change. The emptiness was still there, but it was being joined by something else. Possibility. You know what's crazy? Robert said, addressing the cameras directly. I spent 50 years trying to be the perfect actor, and I forgot that the most important role was just being myself. His voice grew stronger as he continued. Maybe it's time I auditioned for the role of Robert De Niro. Maybe it's time I found out what that character is really like. The studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't typical celebrity applause. It was recognition, support for someone choosing authenticity over artistry. How does it feel to talk about this? Jimmy asked. Like I'm breaking character for the first time in decades, Robert admitted honestly. Terrifying, but also liberating. Jimmy embraced Robert, a real moment of human support and recognition. Robert, thank you for showing us that the greatest performance might be the courage to stop performing. 6 months later, Robert De Niro began working with a therapist who specialized in identity reconstruction for method actors. He also started exploring non-method approaches to acting and began journaling in his own voice rather than his characters. The Tonight Show segment became one of the most shared pieces about acting identity and authentic self-expression ever created. Acting professionals credited Robert with advancing conversations about the psychological cost of total character immersion. Jimmy later said the conversation changed how he thought about performance. Robert taught me that the goal isn't to disappear into a role so completely that you can't find your way back. The goal is to bring yourself to the role, not lose yourself in it. Robert continued acting, but now he approached each role as Robert De Niro playing a character, rather than becoming the character entirely. He learned that his audiences didn't need him to disappear. They needed him to transform while remaining fundamentally himself. The man who had spent 50 years being everyone else had finally decided it was time to meet Robert De Niro. and it turned out Robert De Niro was someone worth knowing.